Hey everyone, and welcome back to the That Luxe Life podcast. It has been a minute. I feel like my last podcast episode was probably over a year ago, if not more. And I had a group of people, and I want to say like a bunch. So a bunch of people reaching out, asking when the podcast was coming back. So they were reaching out on the podcast Instagram channel. People DMing me on my regular Living Lesh one, asking when's the podcast coming back, because everyone's looking for those motherhood tips, the travel tips, the business tips, all of that. And I kept just going, it's coming back, it's coming back, it's coming back. And finally, I set myself to it because as I've been sharing a lot on the podcast and things about business is you have to set yourself a deadline and say, I'm going to do this or you're not going to do it. So as I'm back, my first episode back, I guess we can call it season 2, I wanted to share where I've been, what I've been doing, and why it took so long for me to come back. And I'm very excited to say that as I'm back, you are now able to watch these podcasts on my YouTube channel. So if you are listening to this on like a Spotify or whatever, or Apple Podcasts, you are hearing it. But if you want to see it, you can now go to my YouTube channel, Living Lesh YouTube channel, and you can see the podcast. If you're watching the podcast from YouTube, then of course, always check out my podcast and previous episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere that podcasts are available. But I don't want to sit here and talk too much about where you can see things. I'm not trying to sell you. You're here because you're back. You're trying to figure out what's going on. And I want to share where I've been. And as I'm sharing, I will say that everything that I'm going to talk about where I've been, I'm going to be doing episodes on it later where I'm going to be going a little bit more in detail. So it's going to be very like a brief. I just kind of want to get back into things, introduce you to this season. And for those who are new to the That Luxe Life podcast, this podcast shares a variety of different things about living your luxurious life. That's what we're here doing on the That Luxe Life podcast. If luxury is literally recording your podcast like this, looking like whatever, like I'm at that point, and you'll understand why as I keep explaining. Or if it is traveling on a budget, or if it's traveling luxuriously, or if it's just, running your own business, whatever you define your luxury life as, that's what we're talking about here on this podcast, which is why you'll hear tips on running a business. You'll hear tips on motherhood. You'll hear tips on home. You'll hear tips on travel, on fashion or beauty. I'm trying to share tips on everything that encompasses life so you can take those and build your own luxe lifestyle. So that's what this podcast is about. It is my passion to share these tips. And as we go forward, I'll be sharing more motivational. I'm going to take things up a level this season and offer more, not only visually as we see with this YouTube channel, but also just offering more in-depth details on those tips so you can take them and integrate them yourself. And of course, all these tips are coming from the fact that I've lived the life and I've made the mistakes, and instead of you going and making my same mistakes, I'm teaching you how to avoid those mistakes. But again, that is just what the podcast is about. But let's get into where I have been. So since you last probably heard from me on this podcast, I was sharing how we were building our first custom house. And not that you can really tell from this one little corner of like where you're hearing this from or where you're seeing this from, the house is built. It's built. We are living in it. If you see me on Instagram, that's where like you'll see little tidbits about how we're making our house or home. The one thing I keep saying now is you build the house, but then you have to build the home afterwards. And that's, you put the house, the foundation together, the house itself is livable, but then you have to go in there and make it your own. So since then, we sold our previous townhome, our first house that we bought after living in an apartment with me and my husband. And then we moved into our first townhome where we had my son. And then now we're into our new house, which is we built this house exactly how we wanted it. So we can call it our semi-dream home. If I had all the funds in the world, the house would be a little bit bigger. It'll probably be in a different area. But we are very happy where we are now. And we built this specifically of how we want our home to be where we want to be, where we want to raise our children. And yes, I say children now, but we will get into that. So yes, we're there. And I think the last time I recorded an episode, we were actually in the old town home. I was talking about how to sell a house, how the process of building a custom home, which is a lot of detail. And where the podcast left off is what we ended up doing is, when you're building a custom home, you have to begin paying on that home, even though it doesn't exist. So as soon as, they put a machine on our piece of land that we bought to begin building it, we're paying a mortgage. Meanwhile, we were living in our other townhome, which we were paying a mortgage. So we were paying 2 mortgages. And not the fact that we couldn't afford it, because we wouldn't have went down that avenue in life to build this house in order, like if we couldn't afford it. But I just couldn't fathom, like it wasn't my luxe lifestyle to be paying 2 mortgages. Like I just wasn't there with that. So we had this conversation and with my parents, and they had extra rooms. So, my parents are pretty much empty nesters. So they had a couple of spare rooms in their house, my childhood home. And I had discussed with them about temporarily living with them for a few months, because by the time we would sell our townhome, we would be able to live with them for a few months and get a break of paying for 2 mortgages. And my parents, the saints that they are, they allowed us to do that. My parents have always been very supportive of everything I'm doing, whether it's building a home, having a family, traveling. I'm able to travel with my husband sometimes without our children because of my parents. So they allowed us to move into their home. And I will get into a full episode on that, because as gracious as they were, it was not the easiest thing. It basically was 2 women who run their households in different ways, trying to live under one roof, to the point where it got where there was a whole week where my mom and I didn't talk to each other. But I'm going to go into that in another episode, because I feel like I need to share about a whole episode on adults living back at home when you decide to move back at home, and like how to tackle that. If that's something you're doing, whether you're like us building a home, you're moving, or there's just other life circumstances that have led you there. So because I was living with my parents, my office space was in the basement, and my mother also worked in the basement because she also worked from home. And we were battling on meetings with things in the background, voices in the background. So I could never get to a point where I could stop and record. So that led to me to going, when I get back in, when we get into our home, I'll start this podcast again, because I'll have my own office space, which is what I'm in, because before it was just kind of a little corner of our living room, but now I'm in my own office. I'll have my own office, I'll have space, I'll have time. My son will be going to kindergarten, which we'll talk about that as well. And once we moved out of my parents, it didn't happen. And here's why. So when we moved from my parents' house into our now home, it was around October of last year. Not October, I would say September of last year. Let me back up, September of last year. And to give you a presence, depending on when you're listening to this, it is now November, because it's November 1st, November of 2024. So we moved into our house around September of 2023. We moved in, got settled, and I went into a lot of focusing of putting our home together so it could function. We sold a lot of our furniture from our townhome. So when we came to our new home, we didn't have a table to eat at. We only had a love seat, so we didn't have any couch or living room furniture. We had our bedrooms. That was the one thing we definitely decided to pack up, because we use pods for our storage and movement. And even the biggest pod, any storage facility, we would have had to buy 2 to put our entire home in it. And it was already expensive enough. I just couldn't fathom putting it in. And I wanted to start fresh with fresh furniture. So we basically just had our bedroom sets from our master bedroom, our spare bedroom, and my son's room, our eldest son's room. Didn't have anything else. So I had to, work to get appliances put in the house. So that was a high priority, because We don't have any appliances. We can't eat because I can't cook. I can't put anything in the refrigerator. I can't microwave anything. So we had to get appliances put in. Those appliances were being put in at the tail end of the build. So when we moved into the home, they were there. But it was making sure everything was situated and installed correctly. And then I had to, again, searching for furniture for our dinette area. So we have a dining room in our home that is still not furnished. It's a whole different story. But I wanted at least a table for the dinette area. So I had to go get that. We had to get living room furniture. So I had to order that, get all that put together. So that took about a couple of months to get things put together and assembled, and to get everyone situated. And at the time, my son was still going to his old daycare because I didn't want to put him through too many transitions. There's a lot of transitioning happening at once. We moved out of our townhome, moved in with my parents, his grandparents, and then all of a sudden we moved him out of his grandparents, moved into a new home, and I didn't want to also just like introduce him to a new school at the same time, especially because it was last year. He was just starting in a new classroom at that daycare, so he was still transitioning to that time. So to pick him up just as he got used to it and move him was not ideal. I'm very much into the well-being of my son and making sure he's okay. And I feel like too many transitions on children are a little bit too much. So I kept him where he was. It was only about a 25 minute drive. So, back and forth, I had to drive 40 to 50 minutes to drop him off and get myself back to come work. And then later on, it's another like hour dedicated, which for peace of mind and his comfort was nothing. And I figure because he's entering into kindergarten next year, we'll transition him then. So I was getting him settled in there. We had to get him back into sleeping into his own bed. So due to living at my parents', the rooms that they had that we were staying in had 2 queen and a full-size bed. And the beds were very high up, to the point where when my son being as small as he was 3 going on 4, if he had slept in the bed by himself and rolled off, he would have fallen and hurt himself. And it was too dark. There was just too many things going on. So it just made more sense to let him sleep in a bed with one of us. And there was no way all 3 of us were going to end up in that same bed, in a queen size or full-size bed. So it was hard. It just wasn't to our comfort. But, my son and I, we shared a room, and my husband had a room to himself. So as we came back into now our house where, the master bedroom where my husband and I sleep, my son got his own room back. So we had to transition him back into sleeping in his own bed. So that took some time. So with all of that happening, and then me also, because we didn't have my office set up, because I had to get my office set up as well. That took a month. All of my work stuff, my computer, everything was back at my parents. So I was dropping my son off and then going to still work at my parents' house. So again, I couldn't start the podcast back up right away. And then I was traveling. I was fortunate enough over, the past couple of years to increase in my travel collaborations as a content creator. So towards the end of the year, when we were moving into the new house, I had gone on a fam trip, which for those who don't know what a fam trip is, it's a familiarization trip, which basically is a trip to get you familiarized with the area and promote it. So I went on a fam trip with Visit Florida. So it took a couple of days. There were I went to one on Windstar Cruise, which was a Mediterranean Sea cruise. So that was like a whole week. And there were a couple other trips I was doing at that time. So even as my office got finished, because I was traveling, I just didn't have time to sit and prepare and record the podcast episodes. So it's like, you know what? At the beginning of the year, I'm going to start this podcast. So I was like, I'm going to start it back at January 2024. Well, after I came back from my Mediterranean cruise, which was at the end of the year in December, I was feeling really off. I ended up taking a pregnancy test, and surprise, we were pregnant, expecting our second child. Now, he was a very pleasant surprise. My husband and I weren't necessarily trying to prevent a pregnancy, but we weren't actively trying to get pregnant. Because I have PCOS, I often I was avoiding going on birth control because it was still messing with me, even though it is like recommended to kind of help regulate, but I had gotten off my birth control for a while. And I was trying to let my body adjust. So I just wasn't on birth control, and because of the PCOS, I don't ovulate very often because just of how the symptoms are. So I wasn't really concerned that I was going to get pregnant, but if I did, it was just, we already planned for it to be a pleasant surprise. So it was a very pleasant surprise to find out I was pregnant. And similar to my previous pregnancy with my eldest son, my first trimester was absolute hell. I was throwing up, I was sick, I was nauseous, I couldn't handle it. There were like days at my job where I was like, I need to go lay down. I was working from bed because I just couldn't handle it. And with me being so sick and nauseous, I was like, there's no way I can record a podcast because I'm going to constantly sound like I'm about to throw up. Too much talking made me more nauseous. So I didn't decide to start the podcast. I was like, you know, second trimester, when I get all that energy, similar to, how I did with my first pregnancy, I'll start the podcast again. Well, my second trimester came around in my second pregnancy, and I went into that energetic nesting mode. So we had to get rid of the spare bedroom furniture out of the other bedroom because that's where the nursery was going to be. So I had to work on getting that done. I was ordering furniture. I was putting the nursery together. I was getting all of the things we needed for baby my entire second trimester. And I was still working my other job. And there was just so much going on. And I was still traveling somewhat while I still could. We were planning a baby moon. So that, starting the podcast again, went out the window. And then my third trimester, I was actually contracting very lightly since like 32 weeks. So I was in and out of the hospital, out of my OBGYN's office, getting monitored. So there was really not much time. And because I was in pain and uncomfortable, I didn't really want to record anything. So because of the pregnancy, that put off me starting the podcast again. And then of course, once I had my baby, he was born in August, I just didn't have the time. I couldn't start those. And plus, with a crying baby whose naps are unpredictable how long they're going to be, I just didn't want to start episodes, try to record them, and then be fighting with a sleeping baby. Because immediately I would cut it off and everything would just be in tidbits and tadbits. And I couldn't do that. So I waited, even though I was on maternity leave for 8 weeks. Yes, 8 weeks. It sounds horrible. I only had 8 weeks of paid leave. And then the company I work for doesn't have FMLA. So I had to go back, and I could have just went, you know what, I'm going to, take off. I have my business. I cannot do it. I do love my other job. So I went back, and trying to balance my business, my other job, a new baby. My son had started kindergarten. So that was a whole adjustment. Right at the end of August, I was like, I just have to wait. And now I'm able to start recording again because what we ended up doing for this leave. So I had my leave for 8 weeks. So I had 2 months off. And then I went back to work with my son, with the baby at home, with my eldest son going to school. And for 1 month, I learned to balance everything with the baby. And my husband actually also got paternity leave, and he delayed his because we kind of figured there was no point of both of us being on leave, especially right after he was born. Because I could manage it. I was able to, get my eldest son to school because he's right down the road from his school, where we can just drop him off. And it was just, my husband would have been sitting there staring at me, to be honest. So we just ended up having him delay his leave. And he actually started his leave for a month after I went back. So there was a month I was working, and then now he's on leave. So I'm able to get everything back while he's managing both the kids. And then once his leave is up, he only gets 4 weeks because he didn't birth the baby. But once his leave is up, then I'll be back to managing. So we'll hopefully have a bunch of episodes, recorded, and we can just get all those out so I can keep giving you all this wonderful podcast that I'm so excited to do. And then if our youngest son is now similar to his older brother, by 4, 5, 6 months, he usually gets really calm. Like my eldest son got calm, so I'll be able to do a little bit more balancing, or you'll just hear the baby on the podcast. Like, why not, right? That Luxe Life is living your life how you want to, and if I want to live my life with my baby in hand, that's how we're going to live it. So that's where I've been. But I'm back and I'm excited to share so many more episodes, share so many more tips. I'm excited to relaunch this podcast so you can hear all of the great things I'm sharing here on That Luxe Life podcast. So as we wrap up again, depending on how you are listening or viewing this podcast, make sure to check out my Instagram, my personal channel for the podcast is That Luxe Life Podcast. Make sure you follow along there. There'll be extra tidbits there. Also, make sure to follow me on my regular Instagram and TikTok, Living Lesh. If you are not on the YouTube channel, you're not watching this, you're just listening, make sure you check out the Living Lesh YouTube channel where you can watch the podcast episodes as well as watch some of my other videos, including travels. And if you're watching this from YouTube, make sure you go check out all the socials I just mentioned and check out the previous podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you can find a podcast. But I am, again, so excited to have this podcast back and so excited to share more episodes as we go forward. So the next one we'll be talking a little bit, like I said, more in depth with how I live with my parents, how I adjusted my son to kindergarten. So I'll be sharing more in-depth details of everything that I just went over, as well as starting to just give some more mindset, positivity, living your Luxe Life aspects. So again, thank you so much. Continue on, keep with me, help live with me, helping you to live your Luxe Life.